The next thing we're going to talk about is a little bit more terminology, covering the idea of atoms, molecules, and a few other things. So first of all, when we're talking about elements, elements are composed of atoms. And what atoms are, we will get into this more, but just sort of a working definition is that atoms are the smallest particle that make up an element. And they are unique to the particular type of element that we're looking at. So for example, if we're looking at gold, this is the symbol that we use for gold, AU. The smallest bit of gold that we can possibly make is an atom. So if we sort of think of a block of gold, if we got the smallest little particle in here, that would be an atom. And atoms are very, very small. You can't see them with the naked eye. You can't even see them with a microscope. You can only see them with a very special kind of microscope called an electron microscope. And we'll spend a lot more time discussing atoms and how they're made up and what atoms are composed of as we go throughout the class. But here we're just sort of terminology. And we classify atoms depending on what kind of element they belong to in this thing we call the periodic table of the elements. I have the example right here of what the periodic table looks like. This doesn't have a lot of the information that we typically have on a periodic table, but this is a list of all of the different types of atoms that we have discovered during the last several hundred years, going back to a few hundred years ago when we started discovering the first ones. So atoms come in these are the only types of atoms that we can possibly have. Now, atoms are not the only thing that we have. If we have a compound instead of an element, right, so still thinking about a pure substance, compounds are made of molecules, or some other things that we'll talk about in a minute. And so a molecule is an assembly of two or more atoms. So we represent compounds by looking at combinations of atoms. So probably the one that most everyone is familiar with is water, as an example of a compound that's a molecule, H2O. And this is what we call a chemical formula. And this tells us how many of each type of atom we have. H represents hydrogen, so it tells us there are two hydrogen atoms. And O represents oxygen. We have one oxygen atom, and that makes up one molecule of water. So these are held together by chemical bonds, which, again, we will get into a lot more detail about chemical bonds and what holds atoms together throughout the class. So for an atom, we're going to have something that looks like, just a single element, like H or Au, like I said, for gold. And a molecule will always have more than one atom present in it. So like water that we have here, carbon dioxide, CO2, or something with a few more atoms in it, H2SO4. And again, the subscripts are telling us how many of each atom we have in that particular molecule. Now, one other important concept that we'll see where we use these representations of atoms and molecules is what we call a chemical equation. And this is a little bit different than a mathematical equation, where we're in a math where you're thinking about changes of numbers. In a chemical equation, we're thinking about changes of atoms and molecules as they react and form new substances. So one example might be something like this chemical equation, which represents the burning of methane, which is the main component of natural gas. We'll see several chemical formulas that look like this throughout the course of the class. This is an example of what we call a combustion reaction. And so what's represented here is this tells us we have one molecule of methane, this is CH4, one molecule of oxygen, which is O2, two molecules of oxygen, that's why we have the 2 here, forms 1 molecule of carbon dioxide and 2 molecules of H2O. And the other thing you'll notice on the side here is next to each of these we say what phase they're in. This is what we call a phase symbol. And it tells us whether it's a solid, liquid, or gas. One final thing, another thing that compounds can be made out of besides molecules is we can have ions. And let's just define what ions are if you're not already familiar with it. Ions are like atoms or molecules, but they are positively or negatively charged. So there are some compounds that are composed of atoms or of molecules, and there are some compounds that are composed of ions. So this might be something like Na plus or Cl minus, or you can have multiple atoms in something like SO4 2 minus. Okay, and one last terminology thing is that a positive ion we call a cation, not a cation, but a cation, and a negative ion we call an anion. And that's just so we don't have to say positive and negative all the time when we're trying to figure out which one they belong to.